guys. Here I'm about to start chapter 3, part 2 of Elijah from Buxton by Christopher Paul Curtis. So here we go. Maybe I'd started dozing. I was surprised when old Flapjack slowed down and I felt sticker bushes snatching at my brogans. He'd started picking his way through some blackberries, and I knowed we'd just about reached our secret lake. It was these bushes that old Flap spent all his time in whilst I fished. I hopped off his back and walked down to the river. I went clean over to the other side of the lake and laid down my 2 pouches and my tote sack and net basket and pulled off my brogans and all my clothes. I dived into this lake into 2 parts. First there's the fishing part, which was on the side where I came in at, by all the cattails and lily pads. Then there was the swimming part, which is where I walked to now. I jumped in and let all the sweat from the choring and riding Flapjack float off of me. I don't know how long I spent bathing, but after a while I saw splashes and waves coming from the other side of the lake, and I noted the fish had started feeding. I pulled my clothes back on, except for my brogans and stockings, and picked up my sack and 2 pouches and net basket, and walked back over to the fishing side of the lake, right near where old Flapjack was still eating blackberries. I could hear him snoring and chawing and going at him pretty good. There was a perfect spot for rock fishing just before the cattails got thick. I opened the dead fly pouch and picked out about 4 of them that had a good amount of juices leaked out, and I tossed them right into the spot near the cattails. This would get the little fish riled up. They'd bump at the flies and try to pull them under and would raise a ruckus that'd make the big fish wonder what the commotion was for. I moved till the light was just so that I could see the flashing of the little fish's scales. I went into my tote sack and picked up 2 good stones, one for my right hand and one for my left. Next, I reached into the live fly pouch and plucked out 2 that had a good bit of fight left in them. I tossed these flies at the fishing spot, and one of them still had enough life in him to fly about a little, but that didn't last long, and he soon plopped into the water. Both of these flies weren't accustomed to being wet, and started whirring and splashing and skimming across the top of the lake. There's something about the way those half-wit horseflies move on the water that scares the small fish away and drives the big fish berserk. If I'd done everything right, the big ones wouldn't have no choice but to come barreling out of the cattails and snatch at the flies. I saw the little fish part round one of the flies, and all of a sudden there was a goldy silver fish flash, shooting out of the lily pads. It's hard to explain, but I felt it more than I saw it. I throwed left. The rock and the flash and the fly all met up at the same spot at the same time. It ain't boasting when I say it was a perfect throw. I can say that because for a throw to be perfect, 2 things have got to happen. 1, you have to chunk the fish so he's knocked senseless right off and stays at the top of the water. And 2, the rock's has got to bounce off him and land far enough away that it don't make no kind of splash that'll scare the other big fish. After this rock got done chunking the fish in the head, it skipped 4 times across the water and slipped down into the lake, quiet as a duck, going after minnows. I throwed my net basket out and hauled the fish in. It was a good-sized bass. I strung it up and put it back in the water. I don't know why it is, but something about that basket don't worry the fish too much, and I can toss it in over and over and not scare 'em at all. Maybe it's 'cause fish ain't real smart. I knowed if I was a fish, I'd look at it different. If I saw one of my fish friends go after a fly and all of a sudden he was floating on the water, not moving, and had a big knot on his head, I think my appetite would leave me. And even if it didn't, I sure wouldn't have no enthusiasm for the next horsefly that showed up in the water. I'd have been smart enough to put 1 and 1 together and would have choose something off the bottom of the lake for supper. But I suppose if you're partial to swallowing horseflies whole, it's a pretty good sign that smartiness ain't one of the things you've been specially blessed with. I chunked 4 more big fish and missed on 2 when old Flapjack quit eating berries and gave a strange snort. I stopped moving and looked in his direction. From knowing this old mule, I knowed he'd seen something. Some folks have watchdogs. I've got a watch mule. He started right back up with his blackberry eating sounds, but I knowed something weren't right. I could tell he'd seen someone, and that was someone he knowed. I looked real careful all along the blackberry bushes and the trees, but didn't see nothing. I waited and waited, then went back to the rock fishing. I missed 3 out of the next 5, and I knowed it's 'cause my mind was still wondering why old Flap made that sound. It seemed like you weren't paying all your attention to rock fishing. It seemed like if you weren't paying all of your attention to rock fishing, you weren't gonna do too good at it. I tried to quit fretting, but still missed on 2 of the next 5 stones I chunked. Then the fish quit biting. I had me 7 good bass and 3 big perch. Perch. That's one of my favorite fishes to eat. I summed them up in my head as 4 for me and Ma and Pa, 2 for Mr. Leroy, and 2 for Mr. Segee. And 2 I was hoping to swap with Mrs. Brown since I knowed she was baking today. That totaled up to 10. I emptied what was left of the dead flies in the water and emptied the live flies on a rock. If those flies ever did come round and got their senses back, it only was fair that their lives weren't all the way wasted, and they'd have a chance to fly away. Then I thought about how pesty they are and what they eat. I changed my mind and brushed them all off in the water. I gathered all my throwing stones in my pouch and started pulling my brogans on when a man's voice boomed out from behind me. Now that was the most amazing thing I ever seen. I whirled around and at the same time picked up a stone, ready to chunk whoever it was that had snuck up on me. My left arm went back, and the man raised his hands and said, "No, it's me!" 'Twas the preacher. My breathing came back to me, and I said, "I'm terrible sorry, sir. I weren't expecting no one to be out here." The preacher came out of the bushes and said, "How many of those fish you stone like that, Elijah?" I pulled my string of fish out of the water and showed him to him. He said, "Sweet baby Jesus, this boy's out here fishing without line nor hook, knocking fish out in the head with rocks." "Well, that really does confirm it, Elijah. You've been given a rare gift from the Lord." I'm reminded of Mark chapter 6, verses 33 through 44, where Jesus fed 5,000 people with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. But instead of turning 2 fish into food for thousands, Elijah, you've turned stones into fish. Maybe turning water to wine is more impressive and practical, but what you've done is no mean feat either. The preacher put his hand on my forehead and said, "I've been thinking about how we can best use this gift, Elijah, and I think that we can do something with it to help the whole settlement. You do want to help the settlement, don't you?" This was strange talk for the preacher. He didn't live direct in the settlement. Him and a few other escaped people lived just outside our land because they didn't want to follow all the settlement's rules. I said, "Yes, sir, I want to help the settlement, but how?" The preacher said, "Now don't you waste a moment thinking about it. All I need to know was if you were willing to help, and now I see that you are a fine Christian boy, and I thought you are the fine Christian boy I thought you were. We'll work this out together." I said, "Yes, sir, but I was wondering." The preacher raised his hand and said, "You know what, Elijah? The Lord has revealed to me that since He has given you this gift, I should treat you with a little more respect. I should quit treating you like a child and start treating you like the man you truly are. Pa says when someone sweet talks you like this, you gotta be real careful. And the next words that come out of their mouth. You gotta be real careful with the next words that come out of their mouth. He says the sweet talking is like a rattling snake's rattles. It's like you're getting a warning that you're about to get bit." The preacher said, "So I was wondering, since you're near full grown, maybe you'd like to come with me, Jan, and see if your eye is as good for shooting this pistol as it is for throwing stones. I haven't forgotten the promise I made you a while back." The preacher pulled his jacket back and showed me his fancy pistol. Every thought I had about rattling snake words and sweet talking and bites flew away. Then I remembered what happened last time and how, when it came to my turn to shoot off the pistol, the preacher said he'd run out of bullets. I said, "You ain't funning me, sir. I'm a really get to shoot this time? Shoot it this time?" He looked like I'd hurt his feelings. He said, "Elijah, I'm talking to you man to man, and you have doubts?" I said, "No, sir, I just didn't think." The preacher said, "Good. Let's go on over to the clearing and do some target practicing." I said, "Yes, sir." But soon as I said it, I started thinking about things. Things like, what if old Flapjack didn't want to go no farther? And what would Ma and Pa say if they knowed I was shooting off the preacher's mystery pistol? And how was I going to explain to Ma why I was getting back so late? And the folks were depending on me to bring them some fish. I told the preacher, "Sir, I don't think I can do it now. I got to get back. Ma's expecting me to bring some fish home for supper, and it's starting to get late." The preacher said, "You're right, Elijah, you're right. And that goes to prove my point about you being more man than child. What you've just done is show responsibility. We can shoot this gun on another day. Now you just go right ahead and take those fish back to your ma." The preacher waited a second and then said, "That seems like an awful lot of fish for 3 people. I was wondering, is your family going to eat all 10 of those fish?" "No, sir. Usually I give some to Mr. Segee and some to Mr. Leroy." He said, "A fine Christian thing to do." Now I was also wondering, Elijah, if you know anything about a word called tithing? "Yes, sir. Mr. Travis taught us about that in Sabbath classes. It's giving 1/10 of your belongings and your works to the Lord." He said yes to the Lord through his servant here on earth. What do you suppose 1/10 of those fish is? 3, 4? The preacher might have thought he was the most educatedest man around Buxton, but it seemed like he was a powerful bad at doing fractions, 4th graders. 10 fish. How much is 1/10 of those fish? You do some math yourself. Hope you've got it. I told him, "No, sir. 1/10 of these fish is 1 out of 10. The preacher said, "True, and if you figure 1/10 by numbers, but I was thinking of figuring 1/10 by age. Let me hold on to both of these stringers for a minute." I handed him all the fish. He said, "You good at doing sums, aren't you?" I said, I'm tolerable good longs. It don't get stretched into geometry." The preacher commenced pointing at each fish and calling out numbers and telling me to keep track of the total. "This one's about 14 years old. And this one's 12. And this one's just turned 18. It was the most amazing thing. Some of them he had to look into their mouths to get the age, and some of them he could just tell by holding up. But the preacher knowed all the age of each and every one of those fishes. By the time he was done, I totaled up 122 years. So what's 10% of 122, Elijah? I moved the decimal point without using pencil nor paper and said 1/10 of 122 years comes to 12 full years and 2/10 of a year, sir. The preacher pulled the biggest 2 bass and the biggest perch off the stringers and said, "This perch is 10 years old and these bass are 1 year old each. How many years is that?" 10 plus 1 equals 12 years, sir. So what's left? 2/10 of a year, sir. And how much time does that equal? I guessed that's about 2 months and a little, sir. He pulled the next biggest bass off the string and said, "I was thinking we should throw this one back since he's only a month and a half old." And that's close enough to 2 months that he balances things out nicely. I'll just keep him. I didn't mean to show no disrespect, but I couldn't help frowning. I'd started with 10 fish and now I was down to 6. And even though I ain't particular worthy at my schooling, it still seemed to take a whole lot of doggone humbug algebra and some trickeration geometry to make 10% of 10 come out to 4. The preacher put the 4 fish in on one of the strings and said, I think I'll call on Sister Carolina to see if she's had fish lately. Maybe she could fry 'em up. Then he was gone. And so were 4 of my fish, and as hard as I try, I can't see that as 1/10 of 10. Girls and boys, neither can I. And that's the end of chapter 3.